Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Chapter 2, Living with Loss. I was a Sesame Street kid. The groundbreaking, culture-shifting TV show premiered just after my 5th birthday, and I was transfixed. A multicultural street where everyone seemed to get along, and even when they didn't, they seemed to actually listen to one another and work things out. I was lost in the depth and the kindness of these characters. Bert and Ernie, Cookie Monster, Oscar the Grouch, and of course, Big Bird. They became my first fantasy family and a focal point of clean, fun, and pure imagination. Outside the public broadcasting system, home was not so idyllic. Instead, there were heated arguments, vicious fighting, and fierce competition, with a lot of envy and palpable shame in the mix. Somehow I held on to the hope that we could work things out, just like they seemed to do so naturally on Sesame Street. But this rarely happened. The arguments became louder, the isolation became more profound, and I learned to get my emotional needs met elsewhere, mostly with the loving generosity of my friends' families that adopted me. Every child dreams of a family that gets along and enjoys being together, but this wasn't my experience. When I think back on the idea of a peaceful home, I simply wanted a sanctuary where I would feel safe and protected. Instead, I resourcefully learned how to get lost in the wonderful world of Disney or Sesame Street, or my friends' seemingly harmonious homes. Back in the 90s, my therapist Darlene helped me uncover my family trauma as I began to grieve the loss of the fantasy, while moving toward accepting the reality of my troubled family. It was time for me to come to terms with the losses of my childhood.
Oh, wow, Andrew. So I think like when you said you realized this with your therapist, what year was that?
I started working with Darlene, it must have been 93.
So it was quite some time, like between that, you growing up, before you were able to go back and kind of heal that trauma, did you understand like what you were going through, or did it take that long to just kind of process?
I've been in therapy actually since I was 17, but there was something about Darlene's words, grieving the loss of the fantasy,
Mm,
that really, really resonated and hit me deeply. I think I knew that to some extent, but I don't think I was quite ready to understand that as deeply as I did when I went into that particular therapy.
yeah, that's great that she was able to help you with that.
It was profound. I mean, it was a huge door into understanding myself better.
The first section of this chapter, which is chapter 2, Living with Loss, is called Making Peace with Grief. So, what does that mean to you?
I believe that we live in a society and in a world actually that often doesn't allow grief and loss to have much oxygen. And for me and for many others who allow it to be something that we look at and try and understand its impact on us, it truly is a teacher, right? Grief is a teacher that can show us almost like a mirror who we are and really add texture and dimension to our lives. And I worked in hospice for several years back in the 90s. And so that type of grief, that type of loss where people were dying was an amazing opportunity for me to try and look at how that can be something that can allow me to understand how does this impact me, right? Not just as a clinician looking at a family going through loss, but how can I truly allow for this to be an opportunity and a challenge sometimes to understand how loss works. So me making peace with grief is really about allowing it to have space, being curious about it, being non-judgmental about it, and also knowing that it in recovery is something that can enhance our recovery and help us to be more dimensional people, really, and to be fully ourselves.
And I've heard you mention in the past like different types of grief, like
Hmm.
grieving the loss of something in your life, right? Grieving
Hmm.
innocence.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so there's a lot of different types of grief that not just, obviously the most obvious death one, but leaving, even grieving like the hope of something to happen,
Right,
right? A grieve,
right.
you're in a relationship that doesn't work out, but you had like all this hope for this future with this person, and then what do you do with all that? So.
Exactly. Thank you for mentioning that, Sue, because it's almost like when life takes a detour, right? We are imagining a certain trajectory and then we get fired or we get sick. And there's so many different types of loss based on both things in the past, but also things that we hope for in the future.
So I also see that you read about breaking up with your compulsive past. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. I came up with this idea because there's something about ending compulsive behaviors, ending problematic behaviors that is really like saying goodbye to a part of us, right? Depending on how long we've been in that mode, it really becomes part of our identity. And so imagine if we think about our compulsive selves, or we all have some kind of compulsivity. In this case, we're talking about sexual compulsivity, of course, which is a tongue twister sometimes. But the idea of breaking up is kind of personifying the compulsion, right? We're saying, okay, that part of us, right, which is kind of like an internal family systems idea, that part of us is 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 over, basically. We're trying to say goodbye to the compulsive parts. And sometimes that's a really sad and profound breakup, right? To say, I do not want to do this anymore. This doesn't work for me anymore. This has caused all kinds of havoc in my life, and I don't want the havoc anymore. Now, as we always say, it's not about perfection, it's progress, not perfection. But if we think about that part of us simply as a part of us rather than who we are, there's a way of being able to break up. And one of the exercises that I learned at a retreat was literally to write a goodbye letter. And the first part of the goodbye letter was actually gratitude. What am I grateful for in terms of that compulsive part of me? And then how do I want to say goodbye once and for all to that part of me? Which I think is very clever, right? To talk about the gratitude and talk about the goodbye.
That's so interesting. I really like that. That would be really powerful and super helpful because it is a part of you. The next section is called closing doors, opening doors. And we hear that a lot, like, when one door closes, another door opens. So I assume this
Hmm.
has to do with the future and what might happen once you learn to live with the losses. Is that true?
For sure. So one thing I want to emphasize is that it's not about getting over the loss, right? It's about learning to live with the loss. That's why I came up with this chapter title, Living with Loss, rather than get over it, right? Because sometimes people say, oh, just get over it. Well, it doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah,
But
no.
how we integrate loss into who we are is really what we're talking about. And the idea of closing doors and opening doors is really about saying goodbye to a part of who we were, saying goodbye to certain behaviors. Some of them might have been destructive, some of them might have been fun in some way or another. But are we saying goodbye to certain things that just don't seem to work well anymore? And and that we really want to try to close the door as best we can on it, right? It's not black and white. I mean, we're not talking about a padlock door. We're talking about closing a door and gently opening a new door. And you're right, that the idea of the future is very much embedded in this idea because opening doors is about energy that is more available based on giving up the output of energy that the sexual compulsion has given out in the past, right? So I really love the idea of opening doors because the image is the idea of what's out there that I really would enjoy. What is it that's really going to nourish me? Who are those people and relationships that I've been neglecting that I would like to invest myself in? And so it's kind of like if you think about the program thing or the slogan about people, places, and things that we want to give up, this really looks at what are the people, places, and things that we really want to introduce.
I really like that image of a door opening, and I just see like this bright path and bright light shining through. And it also reconnects your brain in a different way, right? If you're taking a different door. What's
Yeah.
behind door number one, you know? But you got to be careful. You got to close the other one because you don't want your energy going all over the place, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I say to anybody who's listening that it's not black and white, that sometimes there's going to be some stumbling and fumbling. That's part of recovery, that's part of healing. It's an imperfect road toward doing your very best to close the door and break up with the compulsion as best you can, and opening up the door to the possibilities of what has been neglected, really. And what I always ask my clients is, what was really fun and was most helped you feel most free when you were a kid,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And I try and get into that with them because usually there's a clue as to what they would like to do at this point. So I'm going to give an example that you and I know about, Sue. One of the things that I did as a kid was I was a bowler. I was into bowling. I was very competitive actually, and I was in a league and I had my own ball and all that. It was a blue ball, the one that I had at the very end of my teenage career. And I love it. I love it to this day, but I haven't bowled a whole lot in the last few decades actually, a little bit here and there, right? But Sue, you have introduced me once again, a little bit at a time, to getting back out there and doing some bowling.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know if you noticed, but I can get a little competitive.
A little. But you don't have a lot you don't have a lot of competition out there, so
This is
we
true. This is
try
true.
we try the best to keep up.
Yeah, but I compete with myself, which
Yeah,
is, I
true.
guess that's okay as long as I don't get too perfectionistic. But I use the example because that's really an idea about opening doors.
Yeah, I like that. We should get back out there too.
Absolutely. We'll make a date.
So I really do. I love your workbook. I've been using it. And I really like the way you end each chapter with what you call your practice. Would you be willing to share a little bit about this idea and share with the listeners your practice for this chapter? And again, chapter two.
Of course. So as a workbook, I really didn't want this to be dry. I've seen a lot of workbooks that are actually a little on the drier side and some that are more juicy and interesting. But I chose to share some personal stories as I open today's episode just to highlight the themes and the topics and what each chapter is really about to help make things a little bit more relatable. And as Sue said, the your practice section it's simply a way of encapsulating each chapter. It's kind of like a summary, but it's a summary of action steps, really. And I tried to encapsulate them into a few simple ideas or hopefully realistic action steps for you to practice. So, in other words, I believe that really life is one big practice. That's one of my beliefs. And these practices just happen to be, I mean, these just happen to be for you, for those in recovery from problematic or out of control sexual behaviors, or possibly for anyone healing from addictive compulsive tendencies, right? It doesn't even have to be sexual compulsivity. So, with that said, I would like to share from chapter 2, Living with Loss, your practice. Number 1, grief is part of being human, and it can be quite burdensome. Acknowledge, accept, and process your grief to make room for creative energy and possibilities. Number 2, it's not about letting go of the past as much as it's about learning to live with the past, no matter how complicated. You wouldn't be who you are if it wasn't for the past. Grieving allows you to live with the losses while unburdening the heaviness associated with it. 3, fantasy is a big part of compulsive sexual behavior, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Distinguish between healthier, liberating fantasy and obsessive, depleting forms of fantasy. Number 4, swim with your dolphins. Those people who are emotionally dependable, fun, playful, and loyal. Say goodbye to anyone who doesn't meet these requirements. Number 5, regrets are part of grief and therefore part of recovery. Embrace your regrets as an opportunity to forgive yourself and practice self-compassion. And lastly, number 6, on the other side of grief is resilience and resourcefulness. Give yourself plenty of time and space to grieve the losses and experience the resilient part of you. Thanks for listening today. It was so great sharing the time once again with my colleague and friend Sue Merlino and discussing this really meaningful topic, living with loss. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.